And that brings up a good, because that was the debate after 2019. How much of this is him? How much of this is just came together? How much is Joe Brady? How much is Joe Burrow being what he is? And obviously we see him now, and we're going to see him later today or tomorrow in the NFL playoffs. And of course, the guy that he throws a lot to as well, Jamar Chase. So at what point did you and others start to think, okay, Ed Orgeron is the same guy he was at Ole Miss in particular, and he can't handle this, versus, no, this guy, we're not going to tout him as an X's and O's genius, but he can run the program.
The day he was hired. I mean, Mark, really? I was one of the most vocal opponents of Ed Orgeron's hiring. Listen, it was not a popular opinion around here. And it was obvious from the start. Hi, Drew. Sorry, I told you my little boy was going to walk in.
Whatever you need to do.
Fine. Look at the first hire he made, Matt Canada. Before the first month of the season in 2017, he was going to the athletic director asking to fire Matt Canada. They were having altercations on the field. He inherited Dave Aranda from Les Miles. Without Dave Aranda, I don't know that Ed Orgeron makes it beyond the first year at LSU. Joe Burrow, transcendent player. Yes, Ed recruited Joe Burrow. But the reason that LSU even had an open door was because Bill Bush was on staff, and Bill Bush had coached with Jimmy Burrow, Joe's dad, at Nebraska. And Joe Burrow was going to Cincinnati. He was going to play for Luke Fickell, who had been at Ohio State. But Bill Bush said to Jimmy, hey, just tell him to come, have him come on a visit. Just come. And to Ed's credit, this is where we'll give him credit, did a marvelous job recruiting Joe and convincing him why playing in the SEC and playing for a national championship was the route to go, and he did. But Bill Bush was on staff because Dave Aranda handpicked him as the 10th assistant. Dave Aranda was on staff because Les Miles hired him. People bring up Joe Brady all the time. I think we've seen what's happened in the NFL. Joe Brady, his role in 2019, sure, he provided some concepts. Mark, Steve Ensminger was the offensive coordinator that year. Steve Ensminger called the plays that year. Joe Brady didn't work with quarterbacks. Steve Ensminger and George Munoz worked with quarterbacks. Joe Brady worked with receivers. Joe Brady gets far too much credit for 2019. It's not to say he didn't have a role. He did. But there's this idea that Joe Brady was the OC and he was the architect of that offense, which just isn't true.
And that's the narrative that's out there, that Joe Brady's the most popular and well-known non-coordinator in college football. After that 2019 season, he was a rock star.
He went, 1 year, and he was with the Carolina Panthers. But Mark, you ask people around the Saints about Joe Brady, and they're like, you mean the guy that was running and getting us coffee? The guy was like cutting up film? I don't want to be completely dismissive of Joe Brady's role. He had a role in bringing some concepts, but the idea that he was the architect of that offense, you know what that offense was, Mark, in 2019? It was Joe Burrow. It was Jamar Chase. It was Justin Jefferson, the two greatest rookie receiving seasons in the history of the NFL. It was Clyde Edwards-Helaire. It was Thaddeus Moss. It was three linemen that are all starting in the NFL right now that started as rookies. That was an NFL team. They were incredible. And a lot of those guys were recruited by the previous staff. And look at what Ed had to do when he had to hire Bo Pelini, Scott Linehan, Jake Peets. Ed's job's on the line, and he hires Jake Peets. Who'd never called plays before. I don't. This doesn't need to be all about Ed Orgeron, but it just, you ask the question, and it's just obvious. Like, he was always the same guy. He never changed what he was at Ole Miss, and I think LSU fans will be forever grateful for 2019 because it was magnificent. And Mark, as an LSU alum, I would take all of the crap that's come along with Ed Orgeron still, because 2019 happened. But it was time to move on, and they couldn't ship him out quickly enough. And they have a a winning coach who knows how to develop culture and has won everywhere he's been and built and sustained success and is actually mature and can give coherent answers to questions. I mean, it's been a while since LSU's had that in these parts with a football coach.
Because my evaluation of Ed Orgeron, I'm going to say my initial impression, and it's good to see your son.
Right.
My initial impression and then evaluation, which seemed to be just in line with the initial impression, was this is a lower grade Les Miles. This is a guy that inspires young men. They love to play for him. They'll run through a wall for him. He can run an organization, which obviously that did not come home to roost, while Les Miles could. And I'm even dismissing we'll let things go off the field and just turn a blind eye to a lot of things like that. I'm not even going there, just talking about running a football program. But when it comes to being a tactician or an X's and O's, guys, forget it. But obviously he was even less than Les Miles in that regard.
Les was great at recruiting. Les was great at hiring assistants. Very underrated. Les had one fatal flaw. One. He could not take his hand off the offense. If he had just let his offensive coaches do what they would hire to do, he'd probably still be the coach at LSU. But he couldn't do it. And that was his fatal flaw. He recruited great. He won consistently. He hired great coaches. Hired Corey Raymond, hired Steve Ensminger, hired Ed Orgeron as a defensive line coach recruiting coordinator, which is a great role for Ed. Hired Dave Aranda, hired Kevin Steele. Les was a great evaluator of coaching talent. He couldn't take his hands off the stove offensively.